They said water and oil do not mix. They said the ancient, stone-cold traditions of the British monarchy could never bend for an outsider, let alone someone with no title, no fortune, and a background completely alien to the windswept moors of Balmoral. For 3 years, Prince Julian, the spirit of the air, fought a silent war to keep the love of his life hidden in the shadows. He believed that exposing her to the flashbulbs would destroy her, and presenting her to his family would result in his exile. But he was wrong. He underestimated the power of warmth in a cold house. He underestimated Maya. This is the untold story of how a secret romance became the monarchy's greatest salvation. To understand why Prince Julian was so desperate to hide his relationship, one must first understand the atmosphere of the palace in late 2019. The royal family was weathering a storm of public scrutiny, with approval ratings dipping and the press hungry for scandal. Julian, the Duke of Westhaven, was a quiet one, the reliable, stoic royal who cut ribbons and never made headlines. He viewed his duty as a cage, constructed of gold but iron strong nonetheless. He lived a life of monochromatic obligation, surrounded by courtiers who managed a schedule down to the minute. He was a man starved of genuine connection, moving through grand halls that echoed with history but lacked life. He had convinced himself that happiness was a price he paid for his title, and he was ready to pay it, until the day the scaffolding went up in the East Wing Library. Maya Santos entered the palace not to the grand front gates reserved for dignitaries, but through the service entrance used by staff. She was a 32-year-old art restorer from Batangas, Philippines, hired on a temporary contract to restore a series of water-damaged 17th-century tapestries. Maya was the antithesis of the palace ethos. She was vibrant, laugh-out-loud funny, and possessed that distinct Filipino resilience known as matadag. She didn't walk with a hushed reverence that most staff adopted. She hummed OPM ballads while she worked and treated the priceless artifacts with care, not fear. She would support her family back in Manila, sending balikbayan boxes home every month, living a life of pragmatic hard work. She had zero interest in princes or fairy tales. To her, the Duke was just a man who lived in the big, drafty house where she worked. Their first meeting was an accident of geography and timing. Julian had retreated to the library to escape a tedious briefing on agricultural reform, expecting solitude. Instead, he found Maya on a ladder, inspecting a fraying hem of velvet. Protocol dictated she should leave. Instead, she looked down and asked him if he could hand her a brush. He was standing near. She didn't recognize him in his casual sweater, and for the first time in years, Julian was treated like a human being rather than an institution. That simple interaction, passing a brush, a brief exchange about the smell of old dust, sparked a curiosity in Julian that he couldn't suppress. He began finding reasons to visit the East Wing, drawn to the pocket of warmth she created in the austere environment. What started as brief conversations about art turned into hours of shared confidences. Maya spoke of the chaotic, loving noise of her family dinners in Batangas, of the smell of adobo and the concept of kapwa, the shared self. Julian listened, mesmerized. He described a childhood of nannies and boarding schools, of emotional distance masquerading as dignity. Maya didn't pity him. She teased him. She brought him homemade turin wrapped in foil, smuggling it past security, and watched with delight as a senior British royal bit into the sweet, fried banana, sugar dusting his manicured fingers. It was in these stolen moments, hidden behind dust sheets and scaffolding, that the prince fell in love. But with love came fear. He knew the British tabloids would tear a Filipina immigrant apart, and the gray men of the palace would forbid the union. By the winter of 2020, they were effectively living a double life. Outside the palace walls, Julian was a stoic duke, attending galas and standing stiffly on balconies. Inside, in the safe harbor of his private apartments where he smuggled Maya, they were just Julian and Maya. He learned Tagalog phrases, laughing as his British accent mangled the vowels, while she taught him that food was a love language, not just fuel. However, the secrecy was taking a toll. Every time a camera flashed, Julian flinched, terrified that a lens had caught them. He became paranoid, dismissing staff he suspected of leaking information. He wanted to protect Maya from the carnivorous nature of royal life, convinced that if he hid her, he could keep her. But secrets in a palace are like cracks in a dam. Eventually, The pressure breaks him open. The inevitable leak came from a junior footman who had spotted Maya leaving the prince's private residence at an unusual hour. The whisper network of the palace, efficient as any intelligence agency, sprang into action. The Gray Men, the senior courtiers who protected Crown's image, began a dossier. They looked into Maya's background, her visa status, her family's financial history. They saw her not as a woman who loved the prince, but as a liability, a foreigner, a commoner, a potential scandal. Julian was summoned to a private meeting with the Lord Chamberlain, who placed a file on the mahogany desk. The message was clear, and the dalliance, or the machinery of the institution, would end it for him. Julian, usually compliant, felt a surge of unfamiliar rebellion. He refused to break it off. Terrified of losing her, Julian decided to take a drastic step. He would introduce her to the family, but only in the most controlled environment possible. He invited Maya to Sandringham for the Christmas retreat, not as a guest, but ostensibly as a specialist to inspect the estate's art collection, allowing her to be present without officially being his partner. It was a flimsy cover, and Maya knew it. She was terrified. She understood the class divide better than anyone. She had spent her life working in the homes of the wealthy. But she saw the desperation in Julian's eyes, the loneliness that he was trying to fill, and her malasakit, her deep empathy, won out. She agreed to walk into the lion's den, armed only with her dignity and a few formal dresses she had bought from a high street shop. The atmosphere at Sandringham was frigid. It wasn't just the weather. The royal family, sensing the shift in Julian, was on high alert. When Maya arrived, she was treated with a polite, icy distance reserved for staff who overstep. She was given a room in the servants' quarters, miles away from Julian's suite. During the day, she worked on the paintings. At night, Julian would sneak away to see her, frantic and apologetic. Just a few more days, he promised. But Maya was beginning to see the reality of his world. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a rigid corporate hierarchy. Yet, instead of shrinking, Maya's natural character began to bleed to the cracks of the protocol. She befriended the housekeepers, helped the kitchen staff shell peas, and charmed the security detail with her easy smile. The turning point began with a crisis, as these things often do. The king's sister, Princess Amory, a fictionalized matriarch figure known for a terrifying adherence to protocol, fell ill with a sudden, severe flu during the retreat. The mood in the house plummeted. The staff was terrified of disturbing her. The family was awkward around physical vulnerability. The house became a mausoleum of hushed whispers. Julian was distraught, as his aunt was the only family member he was close to. Maya, seeing his distress, didn't wait for permission, drawing on the Filipino culture of caregiving, where taking care of the sick is an honor, not a burden. She brewed a traditional ginger and lemon tea, Salabat, and convinced a terrified footman to let her bring it to the princess's wing. When Maya entered the princess's room, the royal doctors tried to bar her way. She simply smiled, firm but polite, and said, "It's just tea, doctor. It helps the throat." She bypassed them and approached the bed where the formidable princess lay shivering. Maya didn't curtsy or tremble. She adjusted the pillows with the efficiency of someone who had cared for her own grandmother. She spoke softly, not in the high, clipped tones of the court, but in a warm, rhythmic cadence. She coaxed the princess to drink the Salabat. For the first time in days, the princess wasn't treated like a national monument in disrepair, but like an Annie who had a cold. The princess drank. She looked at Maya, really looked at her, and asked, "Who are you?" Maya replied, "Just someone who hates seeing people sick, ma'am." News of the incident spread through the estate. The outsider had breached the inner sanctum and survived. Julian was horrified when he found out, expecting Maya to be fired on the spot. He rushed to his aunt's chambers, prepared to beg for forgiveness. Instead, he found the princess sitting up, looking more colorful than she had in days, listening to Maya tell a story about a jeepney ride in Manila. The air in the room had changed. It wasn't heavy anymore. The princess looked at Julian and said dryly, "She has better bedside manner than a lot of you, and this tea is spicy." It was a crack in the ice, a small one but significant. Maya hadn't tried to be royal. She had just been human. And in a world of stiff upper lips, Her humanity was magnetic. However, the gray men were not charmed. They saw Maya's growing proximity to the family as a security threat. They leaked the story to a mid-tier tabloid. Mystery Filipina staffer cozying up to royals. The article was vicious, implying she was a gold digger using voodoo remedies to manipulate the elderly princess. When the paper hit the breakfast tables, Julian turned pale. This was his worst nightmare. He felt he had failed to protect her. He went to Maya's room, ready to tell her he was sending her away for her own safety, to get her out of the country before the press pack descended. But he found her calm. She was reading the article on her phone, shaking her head. "They think ginger tea is voodoo?" She laughed. "These people need to get out more." Her resilience stunned him. She wasn't breaking. Maya's reaction was rooted in the concept of haya, usually translated as shame, but also encompassing a sense of propriety. She knew she had done nothing wrong. She refused to run away like a criminal. "If I leave now," she told Julian, "I look guilty, and I am not guilty of loving you." It was the first time she had said it out loud. The declaration emboldened Julian. He realized that hiding her had been the mistake. Hiding implied shame. He took her hand and made a decision that would terrify his ancestors. He was going to bring her to the New Year's Eve ball, not as staff, but as his date. It was a declaration of war against the courtiers, a move that would force the family to either accept her or publicly reject him. The night of the ball, the tension in the grand hall was palpable. The guest list included foreign dignitaries, aristocrats, and the entire royal family. When the doors opened, the announcer called, "The Duke of Westhaven and Ms. Maya Santos." The silence was deafening. Maya wore a gown she had reworked herself, incorporating traditional Filipino butterfly sleeves, terno, standing proud in a sea of satin and diamonds. She looked regal, not because of lineage, but because of her posture. She held her head high, gripping Julian's arm not for support, but in solidarity. As they walked down the stairs, hundreds of eyes judged every inch of her. Julian was sweating, his heart hammering against his ribs. Maya squeezed his arm. "Breathe," she whispered. "Imagine they're all in their underwear." The first hour was a gauntlet. The aristocracy snubbed her, turning their backs when she approached. They spoke over her, using complex references to lineage and estates she couldn't possibly know. But Maya didn't try to play their game. When a duchess asked condescendingly where Maya's family summered, Maya smiled and said, "We usually spend summers avoiding the typhoons, ma'am. It brings the community very close together." The honesty was disarming. She didn't apologize for who she was. Slowly, the younger royals, bored by the stifling atmosphere, began to drift toward her. She was funny. She was real. She told jokes that weren't vetted by PR teams. A circle began to form around her, not a judgment, but a fascination. The climax of the evening occurred when the king himself approached the circle. The room went deathly silent. The king, a man known for his adherence to tradition, looked at the woman who had caused such a stir in his household. He looked at Julian, seeing a defiance and a happiness in his son he hadn't seen in decades. Then he looked at Maya. "My sister tells me you make a miraculous tea," the king said, his voice gruff. Maya didn't flinch. "I can make you some, your majesty, but only if you promise to rest while you drink it." The court gasped. One did not give conditions to the king. The king stared at her for a long second, and then a miracle happened. The corners of his mouth twitched. He chuckled. "A fair trade," he said. That chuckle was the signal the court needed. If the king accepted her, she was safe. The tension broke. The rest of the evening was a blur of introductions, but the tone had shifted. Maya wasn't a Filipina staffer anymore. She was a woman who made the king laugh. But the real victory was inside the palace. It was happening outside. The press had obtained photos of her arrival. Instead of the expected mockery, the public reaction was overwhelmingly positive. The image of a woman of color, a working-class immigrant, holding her own in the heart of the establishment, resonated deeply with a modernizing Britain. She represented the changing face of the nation. The narrative flipped overnight from gold digger to Cinderella. In the weeks that followed, Julian stopped hiding. He began to integrate Maya into his public life, and the effect was immediate. For years, Julian had appeared stiff and relatable as a statue. With Maya by his side, he came alive. At engagements, she would naturally crouch down to talk to children or hug members of the public. Behaviors that were strictly against protocol, but wildly popular. She brought the Filipino spirit of Bayanihan, communal unity, to the monarchy. She encouraged Julian to focus his patronage on community centers, food banks, and immigration services. They became a power couple, not because of their glamour, but because of their authenticity. The gray men watched their approval ratings soar and realized that the liability was actually their greatest asset. However, the integration wasn't seamless. There were cultural stumbles. Maya struggled with the loss of her anonymity. She missed the Philippines, missed the noise and the heat. The palace was still a cold, lonely place when the cameras were off. She often found herself crying in the bathroom, overwhelmed by the pressure of being the perfect immigrant representative. Julian, realizing that it pulled her into a golden cage, made a compromise. He demanded they spend a month each year in the Philippines, away from the royal rota. He wanted to know her world as she had learned his. This demand caused another friction with the crown, but this time, Julian didn't ask for permission. He simply booked the flights. Their trip to the Philippines was a revelation for Julian. Stripped of his titles, surrounded by Maya's extended family in a bustling Batangas compound, he learned what loyalty actually looked like. It wasn't about duty to a flag. It was about showing up for Sunday lunch. He saw where Maya got her strength. He ate quinoa and sang karaoke badly in a garage. The paparazzi photos of the Prince of the Realm laughing with his mouth open, holding a microphone, wearing a generic t-shirt, went viral. It humanized him in a way 1,000 PR strategies never could. He realized that Maya hadn't just saved him from loneliness. She was saving the monarchy from irrelevance. She was the bridge between the crown and the real world. Back in London, the dynamic of the royal household had permanently shifted. The other royals began to look to Maya for advice on how to connect with the public. She introduced a mentorship program for staff, breaking down the rigid hierarchy between upstairs and downstairs. She was respectful of tradition, but not enslaved by it. She taught the family that vulnerability wasn't weakness. When the Princess Anne-Marie passed away peacefully a year later, it was Maya who organized a private wake, ensuring it was a celebration of life with food and music, rather than just a somber state affair. The family grieved openly, guided by her emotional intelligence. She had become the emotional anchor of the firm. The ultimate test came 2 years later, when Julian proposed. The engagement interview was the most watched broadcast of the year. The journalist asked the inevitable question, "Do you feel the pressure of being the first Filipina in the royal family?" Maya looked at Julian, then at the camera, and smiled that warm, unpretentious smile. "I don't think about the history books," she said. "I think about the fact that love is a universal language. And if a girl from Batangas can find common ground with the King of England over a cup of tea, then I think there's hope for everyone." It was a soundbite that defined a generation. It wasn't scripted. It was just Maya. The wedding was a blend of high Anglican tradition and Filipino vibrancy. The veil was embroidered with sampaguita flowers, the national flower of the Philippines. The choir sang hymns in both English and Tagalog. Crowds lined the streets, waving both the Union Jack and the Philippine flag. It was a visual representation of a modern, multicultural Britain. Inside the cathedral, as Julian watched Maya walk down the aisle, he didn't see a victory over the institution. He saw his best friend. He saw the woman who had taught him that the crown was just a hat, but family was everything. The gray men stood in the back, silently nodding. They had tried to hide her, but she had ended up illuminating them. Years later, historians would analyze the Maya effect. They would write papers on how she softened the monarchy's image and modernized its approach to the Commonwealth. But for the staff in the palace, the change was more tangible. The corridors were less quiet. There was laughter in the kitchens. The stiff, fearful atmosphere that had dominated the household in 2019 had evaporated, replaced by a culture of respect and diligence that felt surprisingly like malasakit. The Queen Consort, as she eventually became known, never forgot where she came from. She kept her old toolbox from her restoration days in her office, a reminder that everything, even an ancient monarchy, can be restored if treated with care. The relationship also changed the diplomatic ties between the two nations. State visits became genuine reunions. The Filipino diaspora in the UK, often the invisible backbone of the healthcare and service sectors, suddenly felt seen. They had a champion in the highest office in the land. Maya used her platform to highlight the contribution of immigrants, not through angry speeches, but by simply existing in that space with grace. She proved that you didn't have to erase your identity to fit into a new world. You could expand the world to fit you. Julian stood by her, the silent supporter, finally comfortable in his own skin because he was standing next to her. There is a specific anecdote that summarizes their impact. During a garden party, it began to rain, a torrential British downpour. Usually, the royals would be ushered under umbrellas by aides while the guests got wet. Maya, however, grabbed a large umbrella and pulled a group of elderly guests under it with her. Julian followed suit. Soon, the entire royal line was huddled under umbrellas with the public, laughing at the absurdity of the weather. The barrier between us and them had dissolved. It was a messy, wet, chaotic moment, and it was perfect. It was a monarchy Maya had built, accessible, human, and resilient in a storm. But the private moments remained the most sacred. In the evenings, away from the red boxes and the bowing courtiers, Julian and Maya would sit in their private lounge. They would eat sinigang. Julian had developed a high tolerance for the sour soup and watch bad reality TV. They were aggressively normal. This normalcy was their armor. It was what allowed them to survive the suffocating weight of the crown. They had created a sanctuary of truth in a castle built on performance. Julian no longer feared the institution because he realized he and Maya were strong enough to redefine it. Looking back, the irony of Julian's initial secrecy is stark. He had wanted to hide her and protect her from a monarchy, but the monarchy was the one that needed her protection. It needed her warmth to survive the winter of public discontent. It needed her work ethic to justify its existence in the 21st century. The woman he thought was too different to belong turned out to be the only one who truly understood what service meant. She didn't serve for duty or tradition. She served because she cared about people. That distinction saved the House of Windsor from itself. Today, the portrait of Prince Julian and Princess Maya hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. It is not a stiff, formal painting. In it, they are sitting on a garden bench. Julian is looking at the viewer with a calm confidence, but his body is turned slightly toward Maya. Maya is laughing, a genuine, unguarded laugh, her hand resting on his arm. It is titled The Partnership. Visitors often stop and stare at it, not because of the royal regalia, there is none, but because of the light in their eyes. It captures the essence of their story, a love that was meant to be hidden, but ended up changing the course of history. The story of the British royal and the Filipina art restorer serves as a reminder that institutions are made of people and people can change. It reminds us that tradition is not a static fortress, but a living thing that must adapt to survive. Julian wanted to keep his relationship a secret, fearing it was a weakness. Instead, he found that his love for Maya was his greatest strength. In the end, she didn't just charm the monarchy, she humanized it. She brought the warmth of the tropics to the cold stone of the palace, proving that sometimes the most royal thing you can be is simply, unapologetically yourself.